Good evening and a warm welcome to yet another biography event. My name is Kai Bird and I'm the director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography, a wholly unique institution hosted by the Graduate Center of the City University of New York and founded by Shelby White and the Leon Levy Foundation in the year 2007. I want to thank Shelby for her steadfast support to the Biography Center. It is her vision that makes this program possible. Please note that this will be our last event of the spring. We might well have an event or two during the summer, but we are now planning an extensive schedule for the autumn. Please mark your calendars and register for this event on the Leon Levy website. And please encourage your friends and relatives to subscribe to our digital mailing list on that website. But tonight we are gathered to celebrate the publication of Grace Cho's 2021 memoir, Tastes Like War, which was a National Book Award finalist. This event tonight is co-hosted by the Leon Levy Center, the Center for Humanities, and CUNY's Office of Public Programs at the Graduate Center. Grace M. Cho received her Ph.D. in sociology in the year 2005, right here at CUNY's Graduate Center. She is an alumnus. Cho will offer insights into her memoir, Tastes Like War, which according to Vanity Fair, quote, richly braids Korean meals, memories of a mother fighting racism and the onset of schizophrenia. Part food memoir, part sociological investigation, the book is a hybrid text about a daughter's search through intimate and global history to better understand her mother's past. Cho, an associate professor of sociology and anthropology at the College of Staten Island, is also the author of Haunting the Korean Diaspora, Shame, Secrecy, and the Forgotten War. She joins us in conversation with Patricia Clough, Professor Emerita of Sociology and Women's Study at the CUNY Graduate Center and Queens College. Clough is a practicing psychoanalyst and the author of Autoaffection, Unconscious Thought in the Age of Teletechnology, published in the year 2000, Feminist Thought, Desire, Power, and Academic Discourse, and The Ends of Ethnography, From Realism to Social Criticism, published in 1998. She is also the editor of The Affective Turn, Theorizing the Social, a collection of essays by sociology graduate students drawn from various dissertations. Please look for all of these books at bookshops.org, a site that will lead you to your local independent bookstore. Our panelists will be in conversation for about 45 minutes or so, and then we will take questions from our virtual audience. Please click on the question box below to type in your questions, and Professor Clough will be sure to get to as many as she can. We will try to end this program after an hour or a little longer. Again, thanks to Shelby White and the Leon Levy Foundation for funding this and all our other events. And now I turn this conversation over to Patricia Clough. Thank you.
Thank you, Kai, and thank you everyone that has helped to bring about this wonderful reunion for Grace and I. I'm so happy to see you, Grace, and so pleased to be part of the many, and this one especially, celebrations of your very moving, very brilliant book, Tastes Like War. I'm going to read just a little bit of an introduction so that we can go from there. Tastes Like War is a daughter's story about her mother. It is about your mother, her past, her history, her mental illness, the way in which history is lost and recovered. It is your second book about your mother and continues what you began in your first book, Haunting the Korean Diaspora, as a feminist, restoring to understanding the abuse not only inflicted on Korean women, more than 1 million who acted as sex workers for US servicemen, but the abuse of silencing, making unspeakable what had happened to these women and to the people of Korea, and what the US unofficially but historically made possible. But in Tastes Like War, the story is as much about you as it is about your mother, because it is memoir. It is different. The memoir tells more about what you went through to be with your mother, or what you describe as your three mothers, how to respond to each so as to give each a presence, a life, not just in writing, but actually as you lived it with her until the very end of her life. I wondered if you would comment on what it means to you, this move from your first book to the second. What motivated the memoir so many years after the first book?
Thank you, Patricia. I would love to answer that question, but first I just want to thank you, Patricia, for being the person who really led me down this path of experimental writing. I was at Northwestern recently to teach creative writing, and I told the students that I learned creative writing by doing experimental writing in sociology. So that was my very unconventional training that led me to this point. But I think more important that you encouraged me to ask questions that other people didn't want me to ask. And sometimes it was because they didn't think those questions were legitimate, but sometimes it was because, as you sort of reference in your intro, because it was unleashing some secret that they wanted to keep the lid on. So now I guess what I want to say in response to the way you sort of framed the first book is that I'm not sure that I would say it was about my mother as much as it is inspired by and motivated by her. Because I was very clear in that book that the woman that I was writing about was a representation of those real women, but also this psychic figure, right? That was, on one hand erased, but also really overinvested in meaning. And so it sort of lived as this ghost in the Korean diasporic unconscious. And that figure was particularly meaningful to me because she was implicated in my mother and the past that I hadn't known my whole life because it had been kept hidden from me. And so I think about Haunting sort of as this search for context about her past, in which I sought to understand what her life might have been like in Korea during her childhood and her youth. But I also wanted to understand all of those forces of secrecy and shame that had kept this aspect of my mother's history hidden from me for my whole life up until the point that I turned. So I write about it in Tastes Like War right before my 23rd birthday. So that was when I had learned about her past as a sex worker in Korea. But, in the course of doing the research for Haunting, it's like everywhere I looked, there was some version of someone saying that never happened. Right. So sometimes that denial was in the government documents, or it was in the sociological discourse about immigration, for example. But it was also there in the conversations with my family, right? That never really happened. Or, once the secret is unleashed, then to say, well, no, I never said that, and so what I came to realize in writing that book was that there was no way to really know the story of my family history with any kind of certainty. So then, more important than the content of the story about the past, it became the erasure of the story. So it was always sort of like this duality between wanting to know the story, but also wanting to understand the erasure to it. I'm not sure where would be the best place to mention this, but maybe I'll just say it now, that there was a lot of opposition to Haunting the Korean Diaspora in my family, but the only person who really mattered to me was my mom, and she was in support of that book. And I don't know that I ever told you this story, Patricia, that well, as you know, that Grace M. Cho is a pen name that I started using to sort of give distance, create distance from those family members who were in opposition. And I, eventually adopted it as my legal name. But there was one point when my mom said to me, I wish you would publish it under your real name. she said it with so much wistfulness.
Yes.
So, and I really took that to mean that she wanted to be associated with the work, and that she sort of understood my project of wanting to reject the shame.
Yes.
And so during the production of Haunting, my mother suddenly died. And to answer the question of what motivated me to write the second book and how it continued, it was really motivated by my grief, because for various reasons. One was that I never got the opportunity to show her Haunting, and I kind of felt like it was this unfinished project, especially in light of her having sort of expressed this wish for it to be under my, what she called my real name at the time. But another aspect of the grief that really sort of motivated the writing was that all of these memories of food came up, right? So I think I'm guessing it's fairly common for people when they lose a parent to remember a lot of their early childhood memories. And just all of these things about foraging, her cooking, feeding people, all of it came back to me. And I realized that I had forgotten that. Yeah. Through the writing of Haunting, because I was so focused on this history of Korea. And so, part of my initial writing was to just capture those memories, because I didn't want to forget them again. Yeah. And, I think another thing that sort of complicated my grief was that, as Hosu actually said, my dear friend Hosu Kim, who is also a student of Patricia's, had said after reading Tastes Like War that she felt that it was a literary funeral for my mother. Because my grief was sort of complicated by the fact that my family was so fractured that we didn't have anything resembling a funeral. We were sort of like scattered doing these different things. And so after she said that, I realized that it was, in fact, my, sort of my effort to, write a eulogy for my mother. A eulogy, right. And so a lot of the writing was really compelled by my grief. But the other thing I want to say about the move from Haunting to Tastes Like War is that in Haunting, the relationship to my mother was sort of centered around not being able to know or remember the past, whereas Tastes Like War sort of moves the relationship into the realm of shared experience, because these are things that I do know, they're things that I do remember for sure, right? Yeah. So that's probably a much more personal answer than
it was wonderful to read Tastes Like War, having known, of course, Haunting so well, because it had been your dissertation. And I felt like, because it starts, in the United States, not in Korea, not in Japan. I felt that I kind of maybe knew that mother, but not for sure. And then I felt like as I went through the book, oh, I know this Grace really somewhere inside me. I know her. I know this mother, because, we talked about her so much in the years of. I wonder if you'd start us out with reading a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So
carry us along.
Yes, I will read a few pages from the title chapter, Tastes Like War, and maybe just as background. For the last 6 years of my mother's life, she lived in a very nice but small studio apartment that my brother and his wife built above their garage. And so I spent many, many visits with her there. But I'm going to be reading a scene that takes place shortly after she moves in. My brother and his wife seemed to think that things would improve once my mother had a place of her own. I suppose it was a reasonable assumption. During the first few months, she still didn't want to eat. They tried some of the same tricks I'd resorted to when she was at my place in Queens, like leaving food for her in the hopes she'd eat it, knowing how much she hated for things to go to waste. They also stocked her pint-sized kitchen with large quantities of packaged foods that required no more preparation than adding water or opening a can. According to my sister-in-law, my mother was eating the ramen and fruit cocktail, but had barely touched the powdered milk. Although I felt some relief knowing that she wasn't starving, I also felt ashamed that her diet was so bereft of nutrition. Mom, are you getting enough to eat? I asked. She nodded. What about protein? She nodded again, then snorted. They got me powdered milk. Oh yeah? I said, feigning surprise. She became quiet as if she had already lost her train of thought and was deep in some hallucinatory reverie. I can't stand the taste of it, she said. Tastes like war. It was only the second time she ever brought up the war without my prompting. Her words jolted me into a reverie of my own as fragments of my research tumbled around in my head. Images of babies sitting on dirt roads next to the bodies of their dead mothers, and napalmed women bandaged like mummies. The words of a woman who survived the Nogani massacre, who lost her child when American planes dropped bombs from above. That day, I saw the two faces of America. The words of a war bride who remembered American food aid. I had heard of the Yankees and how they were here to save us. We were all hoping for rice or barley, and we drooled at the thought of so much food, but it was an endless supply of powdered milk that caused all who drank it to suffer for days with diarrhea. In February 2002, my mother finally went to the hospital after my brother and sister-in-law called an ambulance and had her admitted on the grounds that she was trying to starve herself to death. After the hospitalization, she started meds again, started to eat again, but still not much, not everything. Her resistance still took the form of rejecting food, but the foods she couldn't or wouldn't eat were very specific, like the powdered milk. After Arnold Schwarzenegger was elected as California's governor, she asked me to stop buying her Arnold bread. Mom, you know it has nothing to do with him, right? The name is just a coincidence, I said. She smiled and let out a little laugh as if she knew how crazy it sounded. She always seemed to put a great deal of thought into her choices to eat or not eat something. In time, I recognized these choices as an expression of agency, tiny acts of rebellion against enormous structures of power.
Yeah, I think it'll please you that I was the most emotional moments in Tastes Like War were about the food and about your relationship to your mother through food, through cooking, through eating, through foraging. And the way you know, I had imagined when you first sent me the manuscript that it would have like recipes or something. But the way you speak about food and eating is so braided into the story, like you just did, for instance, that it's very moving. And the way you're nourishing your mom back to memory is at the heart of the book, I think. And so can you talk a little more about that, about the way you thought of using food and or the actual experiences?
Yeah. I mean, I think in sort of going back to that first question you asked about the move from Haunting to Tastes Like War and how it sort of was born out of this, you know, this flood of food memories. You know, I think in those early days after my mom died, as I started to write down these memories and sort of put things together on the paper, I had this realization that food was her, you know, was like the source of survival for her against all of these huge forces that could have obliterated her, you know. So like that idea of the tiny acts of rebellion and choosing what to eat or not eat. And, you know, when I was at the Graduate Center, I had this conception of her sort of as already obliterated, you know. And, you know, I guess that is one way to understand mental illness, but there are also many other layers of meaning behind it. And so I started to really think about her as a survivor rather than just someone who had been, exiled from the social because of her psychosis.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, I sort of saw these very distinct episodes in her life, like the way that she used food as survival during the Korean War, which also led me to think about how Koreans more generally survived by, for example, scavenging from the dumpsters around US Army bases, or, using the like the remnants of a napalm bomb
Yes.
to scrape out the incendiary jelly from the inside of the bomb and use that as cooking fuel, right? And so like how you can sort of transform these objects of destruction into your own survival.
Yes.
But then, thinking about my own experience growing up in this very small rural town that was xenophobic, I started to see how my mom used food as survival there. So initially it was, I must get access to Korean food somehow. And she went to these great lengths to be able to do that, because unlike a lot of Korean immigrants, because she had married my American father and moved into this, married into this American family, was extremely isolated. So there was no Korean community to support her whatsoever. But I think once she got her bearings, then she started to forage, right? And so she realized that by foraging and sort of creating these businesses around her wild blackberries and her wild edibles, she then had this position of power in the community as someone who had this tremendous capacity to feed people.
Yes.
And, and it was also in a way sort of flipping the script, where it was this community that had in a lot of ways rejected her as this foreigner, but here she is inviting them into her home and feeding them,
Yes. Yeah.
So during that era of my life, I think food was really represented wealth and possibility for my mom. So yeah, I mean, there are a lot of ways in which I think about food as a source of strength for her, and so that it becomes a story that's not just about her unraveling, but about what keeps her from unraveling for as long as she, she sort of had not unraveled. But even then, so you mentioned the three mothers. So that was sort of the first mother, the one who is so productive when it comes to food. And then the second mother is the one who has been hit with the, what the psychiatrists call florid psychosis, right? Which happened when I was 15. And probably the first sign of it was that she had suddenly stopped foraging, and she sort of lost an interest in food. And so in the book, food is also sort of a way that I mark the changes in her mental health too.
Yes.
Right. So by the time, so the second mother is the one who sort of is this shut in, sort of stays in this dark room with the curtains drawn all the time. The one that I was very afraid of, because I just didn't think that I would ever get anything that resembled that first mother back. But then the third part of the book, in which I start to cook for her, that's when the third mother emerges. And it's interesting that you said that I sort of nourished her memory back.
Yes.
I mean, that's one way of reading it, but I think that after writing it and thinking through the story so many times, what I see is that actually my mother is the one who did the nourishing, more of the nourishing, because she taught me how to cook these foods, and they were the foods that my grandmother had cooked for her. So it was, in a way, it was sort of giving me access to this past that I had never had access to, this part of my family history, right? And so I think that she sort of, by doing that, really was to be a mother again in the way that I really wanted her to be a mother.
I also, only knowing her, as you put it, as if she was already obliterated, finding that early mother with you, for me, reading about her was wonderful. She was a tough cookie. She really a hard worker, but, funny. And it was wonderful for you to recover that. And I love what you just said, because if you nourish her back, you nourished her to be the nourishing mother you needed. And so it was quite a wonderful, and you feel it in the book. You feel that process going on between the two of you. I suppose we could call it love, but it's very spicy also.
It's very
food,
spicy,
the
yes.
food sounds delicious. Uh, well, let's move on to another topic. You write in your memoir about a conversation you had with your sister-in-law that had and maybe still has a profound effect on you and encouraged you to study at the Graduate Center in order to understand your mother's becoming sick in spirit, or what in clinical terms is called schizophrenia, to understand mental illness in a larger social, political context. And as a psychoanalyst, I can't tell you, I think that's such a wonderful part of your book. Can you read more about that and talk more about that?
Yeah, so maybe I'll just give a little background. I picked a section to read that actually, it makes a reference to that conversation, but it's not revealing the conversation itself.
Right.
So I had mentioned that I didn't know about my mother's past as a sex worker until about a week before my 23rd birthday, which was when my sister-in-law had told me. It was, you know, right before 1994, or like right around New Year's 1994. And, you know, that it just, that year really made me feel like I had just gone to pieces, because everything that I thought I knew about my family, about my mother, had just sort of been shattered, right? It was like this fiction just completely coming undone about my family, because I realized that, you know, this was the big family secret. And so that sort of is what's, you know, one of the things that sort of set me on this road towards wanting to study. But the other was that my mother's mental health just took a nosedive around that time. And this was after she started medication for the first time. Okay, so I'll read a little from a chapter.
You know, Grace, I don't want to interrupt you, but I am doing that, aren't I?
Yes, please do.
You never mentioned in your first remarks, you said figure, but you didn't tell everyone. I knew what you were talking about. Yes, can you just say that before you read this? Because you were right. You wrote about that figure and it had something to do with this story.
Yeah, right. So my dissertation, which later became Haunting the Korean Diaspora, was centered around this figure. In Korean is the word is Yanggongju, which translates as Western princess, but then it's also translated as Yankee whore or GI bride. And it's the figure of the woman who who provides sexual labor to American men, either through marriage or sex work.
Right.
So yeah, that was the research project.
Yes.
Thank
you.
So I'll read a few excerpts from this chapter, which is set in 1994. Worthless. That was the word my mother used in the hospital after she swallowed 4 bottles of antipsychotic drugs and was delirious from the chemical residue. Why, Mama? Why would you do something like this? She giggled and lolled her head from side to side against the pillow, reached her hand out and tweaked my nose as if I were a little girl and not a young woman starting my adult life. Grace has a cute not big American nose like abuji. She then lapsed into a mixture of Korean and gibberish before answering my question in clear, sober English. Because I feel worthless. That word, worthless, insinuated its way into my psyche and took up residence there like a disease. I spent the next 15 years driven to find out where my mother's feelings of worthlessness came from, to get to know that place intimately, and to somehow rid myself of the malady. In the days immediately following my mother's death, I became awash in memories of her better days, long before she uttered those words, I feel worthless. I asked all the people who had once known her what they remembered most about her. Unequivocally, it was the blackberry pie. It seemed as if her favorite pastime, aside from picking blackberries, was baking blackberry pies. It was perhaps not so much a pastime as it was a compulsion, a need to produce something with the sweat of her own labor that she could call her own, that she could choose to give away and not have taken from her. So many Sunday afternoons she spent with her sleeves rolled up and her arms immersed in giant bowls of flour and shortening, her fingers working the fat and flour together into little pearls of dough. By the end of the day, there would be a dozen hot blackberry pies cooling on the counter, waiting for someone to break open their shells. In retrospect, I see that the blackberries were the real stars of her pies. Small, wild blackberries, as my mother distinguished them from other blackberries. The ratio of crust to berries was always perfectly balanced. But to my immature palate, the filling was just a condiment for the crust, one that I considered optional. Sometimes I would ask if I could just have the crimped edges, and once she gave me permission to eat the entire outer crust, I took the liberty of helping myself the next time. One day, lured by the scent of caramelized blackberry juice bubbling against the flaky brown pastry, I went into the kitchen and ate the crusts of 4 or 5 fresh pies that were on the counter. My mother was somewhere else, maybe stealing a moment to nap or tending to her roses in the backyard. Later, when she discovered what I had done, she shrieked, "Grace, you ruined my pies. I was going to give them away and now they're so ugly. All that work for nothing." Despite her initial rage, she found a moment of humor in it and dubbed me Crust Girl. When my brother's wife told me the big family secret, it was to explain my mother's mental illness, as if her past were an answer and not in itself a question. The confluence of developments that year flipped a switch that could never be turned off. I devoured any film, novel, scholarly book, or article that engaged the theme of sex work, particularly if it was set in Asia or involved a military or an interracial romance. Though much of what I consumed left me feeling queasy because of the absence of a big picture, the frame always drawing the eye toward the individual. I also became hyper attuned to the way in which people of all genders casually and frequently use the words whore and slut as pejoratives, the way in which these insults were pervasive in every aspect of popular culture. This would be the beginning of a wondering, how much had my mother's sense of worth been bound up in that stigma, the excess of shame reducing her to nothing? I understood then why my education had been so important to her. It wasn't only so that she could live out her vicarious dream of becoming a scholar, but also to make sure that I would never have to face the same choices she had. Work with your mind, not your body, she would urge whenever I expressed an interest in physical labor, like the first time I took a job in a restaurant kitchen. As much as I liked school, my decision to spend 7 years in graduate school was largely motivated by that fleeting moment, perhaps less than 2 seconds, during which I heard the words, "Your mother used to be a prostitute." By 1998, I enrolled at the CUNY Graduate Center, further committing myself to find out what could have shattered my mother's spirit to the point that she'd feel worthless. My project was to eke out every possible connection between those two sets of words, "Your mother used to be a prostitute," and "I feel worthless." While I had already spent years thinking about my mother's situation, the work of systematically breaking it down began in my first year sociological methods class, in which we were asked to write weekly research questions. I never explicitly mentioned her in the assignments, but she was present in the subtext of everything I wrote. What structures and systems and geopolitical events created a social context in which she dared to transgress her societal norms to enter the sex industry? Once there, what small actions and gestures slowly eroded her self-esteem? What large-scale transactions crushed her psyche? Once out, did the same things happen all over again, just in a different time and place? The answers to these questions were not at all obvious. Later, after I had spent a decade on my investigation, my sister-in-law would say that she had only told me because I ought to know, because she was speaking woman to woman. Somehow she expected me never to do anything with those words except to lock up the secret myself and never speak of it again. When I had made it my life's work to openly interrogate the words that had haunted me, when I had written hundreds of pages about them, my sister-in-law revised the storyline. Your mother was a cocktail waitress, nothing else. But it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether she was a cocktail waitress or a prostitute or something in between, because those words, when they were first spoken, changed me. Your mother used to be a prostitute. That bit of new information was so huge that it erased my old memories. It made me forget all those years when she was my mama, the woman who called me crust girl and was famous for her blackberry pies.
Hard to follow up. You know, Grace, I've been thinking, preparing for this, that of course, I too saw things about my mother that no one else saw or wanted to see.
Yeah.
And that there was a kind of an identification with you,
Yeah.
and your project as your teacher. So it's been a gift to me, you know, like what you said about your mother, the circle. So it's happened between us too, I think. Along those lines, I want to say how important I think the book is about memory, and the feeling you have when you're reading the book that's so beautifully written, but you're trying to capture every memory and put it into words and give it to readers and give it to yourself. And it feels like you are, and you mention it, that you feel so alone because you're alone with your understanding about your mother, which is such a hard part of what you went through. And I want you to speak to what you write about in the book, but even maybe say more about what it felt like not to be believed by others, by your family, and to have to pursue understanding the memories and your mother's life and your life against that resistance.
Yeah, I mean, I think to give the audience a little bit of context, there's a moment in the book when I was 15, and it became apparent to me that my mother had some sort of mental illness, and I researched it on my own in the high school library. That basically diagnosed her myself from, you know, a couple of books that were in the library, and then told my brother and father about it. And their reaction was denial and punishment of me for saying that. You know, they called me a liar at the time. And, you know, I think that what it taught me was that there are certain words that I was not allowed to say without being punished, right? There were certain things I was not allowed to do, even if the intention was, you know, to seek help, right? And so, yeah, so that I think that my coming of age from particularly these two moments that I'm sort of focusing on in the talk tonight, like right before I turned 23 and then at the age of 15, that really sort of formed my identity as somebody who was not exactly alone in the family, but really sort of aligned with my mother, right? And you know, so I think that I've also sort of had this identification with my mother as this person who was, you know, in her family as well, ostracized because of the choices that she had made. And so, you know, I think that putting it all down in the story also allowed me to see that a little bit more clearly, and also to feel, I guess, like almost like I feel secure in that position now as the person who is cast out in the family, because I know that it can't be any other way, right? So that I am the one who's going to speak, you know, this version of the truth, right? This is my truth. I know that truth is something that's very objective, And there are other people who might not even recognize my mother in this story.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it was very, but as a child, it was very isolating. And after the rejection from my family, I was very afraid to talk about what was going on with her, but I did anyway, because I was always sort of propelled forward to try to do the next thing, to try to figure out the next thing in relation to this, this problem that I saw with my mom. And then I went to the community mental health care center, where the counselor validated my perception of things, said, yes, she does appear to be schizophrenic. But then he said, but there's nothing that we can do to help your mother. And it's too late now. There's nothing you can do for her. So then, like, being told by the authority figure to just go home, and that her life wasn't worth trying to save. Basically, that was the message that I got. And so I did, in the memoir, I sort of described that as the origin of my Han, which is this Korean concept of it's translated often as knotted grief over injustice. But it was also sort of the feeling in my chest at the time of like this knot of all of these feelings of confusion and rage and, grief all tangled together. And then, so sort of going forward through my life as a scholar and a writer, it's always been about trying to untangle that knot. And what I think that what that has done for me, though, is that it has sort of allowed me to follow all of those threads and see this from a much more expansive view than I ever did, when I was young.
When you were young.
Yeah, or that I ever could have had I not dedicated so much of my time, so much of my life to this project, right?
Yes. It's as a sociologist or as fellow sociologist, it's so wonderful to me because it is what I believe, that a lot of research projects have these personal stories underneath that we're supposed to sort of keep out, talk about not speaking certain things. And, I love supporting your own insistence on making that story come through. And now in the memoir, it's just absolutely, simple and straightforward and beautifully clear about what motivates thinking. I think everyone's thinking, but some of us are forced to reveal it more than others. There's this wonderful, just to close, because then we'll take some questions from our audience. There's this wonderful little section, just a little paragraph or two, I think it is, where you, it's near the end of your mother's life, maybe, where you have this wonderful visit with your mother, and you have this occasion in which she has comfort, you give her this comfort food, ironically in a chapter called Cheeseburger Season.
Yeah, that chapter is, maybe I won't give any spoilers.
Yeah.
I'll read it, a couple of pages, 2 pages. By the time I finally learned to listen to my mother's cravings, she stopped making me guess what she wanted. She made regular requests for Korean dishes she hadn't eaten for ages, like jangjorim or chapsaltag. The flavors transported me back to my childhood, to my first mother's embrace. Though it took years for me to fully absorb the significance of these meals, it was sengtae that would make me understand that feeding her had the effect of gently releasing the past. It was a dish that I had never tasted or heard of before, but I cooked it as per my mother's instructions. Saute radishes in sesame oil until they begin to soften. Don't be ashamed to use sesame oil. Put in garlic, plenty of garlic. Now, don't be ashamed to use that either. Her recipes were like incantations against a history of being rendered inferior. Add fish, dashi broth, scallions, gukkanjang, and gochugaru. Bring to a low boil and serve with rice. We sat down on the floor around the glass-top coffee table to eat the fragrant fish stew, and I contemplated the balance of flavors, spicy, smoky, pungent, and sweet. I haven't tasted this in 40 years, she said. Her voice was soft, dreamy. Wow, it's so good. How come you never made this when I was little? I guess I just never craved for it until now. That was always her answer when I asked why we were eating something now, but not then. What was it about the now that stirred up her cravings? Does it taste the same as when you used to cook it? I never cooked it, she said between slurps of garlicky broth. Really? How did you know how to make it? It's how I remember my mother making. I couldn't believe that she had successfully taught me how to make such a delicious dish based on a 40-year-old recollection of watching someone else cook it. Throughout her life, sengte jjigae was something that others cooked for her, the most comforting of comfort foods. The recipe, the memory of her mother's hands, had been lying dormant on her tongue for all those years. Tasting it must have been a kind of homecoming. The experience of awakening her memories moved me so much that sengte jjigae became a family treasure, something that I didn't want to cook too often so as to not diminish its importance. I made it only when she specifically asked for it. After one such request, I heard from my sister-in-law that she had been thinking about it all week long. Are you making your mom that fish stew? She said to me. She keeps talking about it, how she's really looking forward to it. Our Korean dinners became beacons around which her uneventful life was structured. From the moment I walked out the door, the countdown to the next meal would begin. That Monday, when I returned to the Graduate Center, Hosu and her girlfriend asked me what I had cooked for my mother over the weekend. They would always take delight in hearing about our dinners, but this time, as soon as I told them it was sengte jjigae, they screeched, laughing so hard they doubled over. What's so funny? I asked. Nobody from our generation makes that, Hosu said, breathless from laughing.
It's so great. I mean, it's such a great example of how the food is in the story. But that was towards the end of your mother's life?
It was, yeah. And it was also the last meal I cooked for her.
For her, yeah.
Which comes a little later in that chapter.
Yes.
Yeah, also, as I'm reading these sections, I realize how much the Graduate Center is also woven into the story because the time period in which I was cooking for my mom coincided exactly with the time period in which I was at the Graduate Center and then revising the dissertation into my first book.
I definitely remember.
Yeah.
I'm not going to, I want to ask some questions. It's too bad. I wanted to talk a little bit about our relationship to you, you wanting to not finish your dissertation because you wanted to be a baker.
That's in the book as well, isn't
yes.
it? Yeah.
I think it is, yeah. So let me, there's some wonderful questions. Here's one from Catherine Chung. Thank you for sharing the very intimate and open experiences between you and your mom's life. It gave a window into a story that is probably shared by many Korean first-generation immigrant women who haven't been able to share their trauma with their own children. I think family members can experience trauma differently despite living together. Are there any other stories you have that maybe didn't make it into the book?
There are many, yes. No, I mean, absolutely. Because when you're writing a book like this, you have to make a lot of choices about what stories to put in and what stories to leave out, right? And so I wanted to keep the focus really on the relationship with my mom. And so that's why the other characters in the book, like the other, family members, like in that traditional sense of the word family, are not so present in it, because I didn't want to tell other stories that sort of maybe would, sort of move away from that goal of really thinking through this relationship and the way that my entanglements with her trauma sort of drove me forward. But yeah, so there are many that I left out. And then there were 2 chapters in an earlier version of this that got taken out. So one of them has been published elsewhere. So it's in a journal. It's in one of Norman's sociology journals. I can't remember which one.
Critical methods.
Probably cultural studies, critical methodologies. And I have another piece. This was not a chapter that had been taken out, but it's sort of like a postscript that I published in Catapult magazine And and then there was a whole chapter about my dad that I liked, but I kind of felt like it was the outlier and it didn't quite fit. So that isn't in there either.
I did like reading the way you did represent your dad. That question raises another quick question. How much has this meant for you to write for other Korean readers, and imagined others going through similar experiences?
Yeah, so honestly, like, I don't know how much I was thinking about that when I was writing. I mean, I knew that it would resonate with those readers, but I don't think I was consciously writing for them.
Right.
But the reception has been pretty remarkable in that so many people have written to me saying, my mother is also Korean and my father was American, and they found something in here that sounded like their story. Like sometimes it was, my mother was also a forager, or but very often my mother also had schizophrenia, or what appeared to be schizophrenia. So yeah, I mean, it has been really meaningful, just because I think until recently, haven't been a lot of our stories out there. I think that's starting to be corrected. Now that we a whole bookstore dedicated to it in New York now.
That's great. Okay, here's from T.A. Tran. After your mom passed away, were there aspects of your relationship with her that felt at peace with you? And were there aspects that you still feel unresolved about?
After she passed away. So, I mean, it really was through the writing. I mean, I think it was through the writing of this. And, like I think in the way that the memories of my early childhood came back to me, it almost felt like, her spirit was visiting me and asking me to remember her. So, I think that lots of things that I'm able to see now about her have given me a sense of peace. But, as I was saying at the beginning, the one thing that still sort of nags me is that she kind of wished that I could have published my first book under the same name that she had. So I think that's something that still feels unresolved.
There's a lot of focus in sociology. I remember myself reading about Italian mothers, immigrant Italian mothers, that they most likely would be crazy. That isn't the language they use, but the statistical analysis focusing on mental disorder on immigrants. So there's something very wonderful about the book in the sickness of the spirit rather than schizophrenia. Here's another one. Salvador Vito Ortiz. Hi, Salvador. Salvador is another former student, and you were in graduate classes together? Tastes Like War to me is an invitation to braid relationships through memories with our beloved ones, through whatever conduit we have. I found myself wanting to identify those mechanisms that bridge myself with my own mom, understanding her, but through her own lens, an extension of the active agency you spoke about. Question. Throughout, senses are involved as a backbone to the memoir. Time, however, works in nonlinear ways. As a writer, what did you intend to accomplish with the movement between the time periods? Yes, this is important, how you move through the time periods as a strategy. What does it do for your own sense of letting the story flow? Does moving, playing with the time order allow for a different sense of facing the silence, the shame? Or does the memoir as a second book work against past beyond the shame altogether? The untangling of your knot you just mentioned.
Yeah, I think that the playing with time is partly a mechanism of untangling the knot, because it is so, it is so, yeah. I mean, words are escaping me right now, but yes, you know what this means, right? To be able to follow these threads out, because they lead to different times and places, right? And so that the linear story isn't necessarily going to convey that. But, you know, some of it is what I learned from you, Patricia, when we were doing experimental writing at the Graduate Center, of thinking about the temporality of trauma and how to make the text perform that, right? And so,
Yes.
you know, like, because the, you know, a traumatized memory always has the past and the present, or the future and the present. And it, you know, it's all mixed up, so that I wanted to write in a way that sort of mirrored that. But I also, I guess I was also thinking about what I had said earlier about that year, 1994, when it felt like the story of my family just sort of crumbled,
yes.
that I wanted to have an experience for the reader in which you're sort of reading along this sort of smooth narrative, and then something comes and interrupts it, and like takes you out of that moment.
Yes.
Because that's what it was, you know, that's what the lived experience was like.
Too.
Yeah.
I'm thinking the word unconscious, because that's what's there, you know, all these threads that you have to trace and follow. And it's very important, I think, as you're saying, that the challenges to your story by your family or anyone else fails to understand the working of the psyche and the efforts to remember and to honor how one's body has held those memories, and the absolute necessity to speak what we would call the unspeakable. And that's always a work of great research, but also a work of art, right?
Yeah, thank you.
And you're definitely an artist. Definitely. Let's see. I'm seeing all old friends here. Jean Halley, thank you so much, Grace and Patricia. This is so beautiful, as you are both. Oh. I am very grateful for this event and for getting to hear you both. Much love to you. So that's not a question, but we're happy to have that, Grace. Jean. Okay, John Sisto. Was your mother a woman of faith? Many Koreans are extremely spiritual, whether Buddhist or Christian. Was this part of her experience as well as yours?
No, so I don't really know that much about my mom's spiritual life, because that was another thing that she didn't talk about a whole lot until much later in my childhood. At some point, I think it was maybe by the time I was in high school, and maybe it coincided a little bit with the development of the schizophrenia, that then she came out as Catholic. But I've never known that, because I'd never known her to go to church.
Yeah.
But I think, you know, sort of now, knowing what I know now after having done all this research, you know, in Korea, during that time period, women who had biracial children could not enroll their children in public school. Wow. Biracial people were not allowed to attend public school, so they went to the Catholic schools. So I don't know if her engagement with Catholicism sort of began there, or if it went back to that. But she also seemed to have some trauma related to religion that she never really talked about.
Yeah. Although, you know, it's kind of the food is a bit of a ritual and has a spirituality to it, you know. Here's Chris Berry. Why do you think that you alone had the courage to focus on your mother's psychological deterioration, and only you had the courage to try to get her some help? Did you feel appreciation from your mother with your obvious devotion?
So I think at the age of 15, the reason it was me is because my brother was 22 at the time and had been not living at home for 4 years. And my father was a merchant marine who was gone for 6 months out of the year. So much of that time in my life, it was me and my mother together. And so I was very invested in wanting her, you know, in her wellness, because she was sort of the center of my family life, you know?
Yes, absolutely.
So I don't know that it was so much about my courage at that time as it was about my desperation. And what they told me at the mental health care center was, quote, only the police can make her get help. So as a 15-year-old, what do I do with that information but call the police, which of course now I know is a terrible idea.
Yeah.
And it was something that my mother did not forgive me for many years. And so we had like a pretty rough road for, up until the time period that I started cooking for her, like when we were a couple of years into it. Then she said to me at one point, I realize now that you love me.
Yes.
And that she, and she said it was, and I said, why did you think that I didn't? And she said, because you called the police on me. It was something we hadn't talked about for many years.
Yes.
But from that point, like that was sort of this moment of reparation. And from that point forward, I think she did sort of regularly express to me that she appreciated the things that I did for her.
Yes.
I don't know that she would have put it, like she would have phrased it the same way that Chris did in terms of getting help, because
Yeah.
I don't know that she always thought that the interventions were helpful. And I also didn't think they were always they were helpful
either.
like not the ones that I did, or the ones that came later in her life from other family members.
Yes. One or two more I think we can do. Skyanne, for me, I found it interesting how you wrote about a multiplicity of hungers. I took hunger as both a physical sensation and an affective condition as I read your book. Hunger is evident in the many impoverished Koreans, like your family members, had starved because there was nothing to eat amidst the destruction of the Korean War. So in this sense, to be hungry is to be affected by something, namely the structures of war and imperialism. But it is also a matter of Korean women like you and your mother craving a sense of belonging, language, and meaning to your experiences as you reckon with your racialized, gendered, and hypersexualized realities in the US. On that note, as much as Tastes Like War talks about food, cooking, feeding each other, and as forms of reviving the memories of loved ones, how do you reflect on hunger in terms of deprivation, dissatisfaction, and foraging as critical analytics for showing how personal memories as a racialized minority are inextricable with America's xenophobic history? Thank you, Sky.
Oh, that's a beautiful and insightful question that would take me a while to sort of unpack. But I do talk also about deprivation. Like there's this moment, right, where my mom she was living with my father at the time, but they were not speaking to each other. They sort of lived in these separate worlds and acted as if the other person didn't actually exist. And, and so I sort of posed this question, if food is love, what does it mean to be deprived? Like how hungry must she have been to be deprived of this love and of this human touch when, she was only getting this human touch maybe once a year or twice a year from me or my brother. And that, that the state that she was living in, I do see as a direct result of all of these things that you're talking about, Skyanne, of imperialism and racism and phobia, right? So, because that's sort of the main question that I ask in this book, right? Like what are the ingredients to, my mother having to live under these conditions? Like what created this?
Yes, I'm afraid that'll have to be the end. I was going to say your book is an answer to that question, and I'm sure that's what Sky was picking up too, that's all in the book. Well, that was our last question, I'm afraid. My thanks to Kai Bird and the Leon Levy Center, and to Shelby White for her generous support. And I'm so happy to have spent this time with you, Grace. See you soon, and good night to everyone.
Thank you all.